Hey, it's Brendan. Thanks for joining me today on If I Knew You Better. Today's episode is a follow-up to my original conversation with Chris VOGLER. Let's get to it. Welcome back to the show, or welcome for the first time if it's your first time listening. I'm Brendan Davis, and I host this thing. And today I'm really pleased to present this conversation that I had with Chris VOGLER about a week and a half ago in Palo Alto, California. I have been on the move quite a lot, and we discussed it very briefly in the episode, and it's not really relevant to the topic so much, but I'll just mention that if you've been following this, you know that I usually am based in Beijing. And I was coming back to the States anyway to kick off this film project that's been long in the making. And I had plans to travel in a few weeks, but because of the now world-famous novel coronavirus that has caused such a stir and such a tragedy, especially in China, but it's extending other places, I got an early flight before it was as serious as it now is. And in case you're curious, I basically have self-quarantined at home here at my mom's house in Birmingham, Alabama, after a very brief stopover at my film partner Larry's house in Palo Alto, and was masked and took precautions and sanitized hands the whole way, didn't eat on the flight, all those sorts of things. That's sort of another topic. But speaking of another topic, in this conversation, Chris VOGLER and I get into sort of a follow-up on a theme that emerged in our last episode. I'm going to link that one here in the show notes as well, so you can go easily find that one and check it out if you're curious. You don't have to hear that first to totally appreciate this as a freestanding piece, though. In that episode, we really talked about the path Chris took in his career, what put him on the map, and he was really the person who explicated the learnings and lessons of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces into what became known as Chris's best-selling classic book, The Writer's Journey. And he identified the hero's journey as a principal structure with which mythic films and heroic films adhere. But along the way, he's continued to learn and grow and think on new ideas. And that's really reflected in the 25th anniversary edition of his book, which is coming out this summer, courtesy of Michael Wiese Productions. And I really was taken with something that Chris got into at the very end of our last episode. He just sort of dropped this casually, and the California esoteric hippie in me perked right up and said, wait a minute. Tell me more about this. And so in this episode, we get deep down the really cool rabbit hole where Chris talks about several of the other modalities that he's using to examine storytelling, the emotional impact on the listener or the reader. And he discusses how to apply it in some practical terms. And I have an advanced copy of the book, which has been very cool to get to read that. And all of his new chapters detail many things that are sometimes adjacent to the original thesis, sometimes completely, of their own making, although you can relate aspects of it to the hero's journey. But it's not just that. He really expands in print this universe that he's continued to expand in his own thinking and work over many years. So it was time for a big refresh on the book, and it was certainly time for a big catch-up. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Chris VOGLER. Well, I'm very happy to welcome back to the show returning champion, Mr. Christopher VOGLER. Chris, how are you, man?
Brendan, I am doing very well and just delighted to be back again, have another shot at it.
Well, I'm super happy to have you back. I have put the link in the show notes for our previous conversation, and I really encourage people to check that out. And we may inadvertently have a little overlap because of the nature of what we're talking about, but that one is really an in-depth version of your journey, how you developed from the early days all the way through your writing of The Writer's Journey, of course, your landmark success, this reference book in storytelling. And we're talking today for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is to pick up about the new 25th anniversary edition that's coming out soon. I'm got the galley of it, so I've been able to already review it, which is, thoroughly entertaining, and I'll talk about that. But we also want to talk about what you're up to, because I understand that there's more to you than just this book, as massive of a landmark as you have here. So for the sake of just getting, in case someone's listening to this for the first time and they haven't gone back yet, just give us the quick snapshot in your words of what your story is, and then we'll kind of dig into the more recent developments, if you don't mind.
Well, sure. Yeah, I sort of create the legend of myself that I am a farm boy from Missouri. That's the truth. From the St. Louis area. I came west in 1971. The Air Force sent me out to Los Angeles to make documentaries for the Air Force. And I jumped off from that into going to film school at USC. And there I ran into the ideas of Joseph Campbell, which was very helpful to me because I was looking for the secret code to storytelling. I was fascinated by stories, movies, and really interested in them structurally. How do these things work? Are there any rules or guidelines or principles? It can't just be random. And when I found Campbell, or was guided to it by a helpful professor, I sort of had a door open for me that led me into the career that I followed. I went to work for the studios as an analyst of stories, somebody who reads the scripts or whatever is submitted and makes recommendations in a report about that for the studio heads. And it turns out I was good at that, and developed this hero's journey idea that I got from the work of Joseph Campbell into a theory, and sort of made it my own, applied my particular sauce and my experience as an analyst who, after a while, had read thousands of scripts. I had some database to go by. And so I took some time off from work and created first a short memo that laid out Campbell's ideas in an easily consumable form as a kind of a template for what's the internal structure of almost every story. Although they vary a lot, they are related all somehow. There's a spinal column that unites almost everything we call a story. And then eventually that developed after teaching for a while at the UCLA Extension Writers Program. I polished up this idea, and eventually through connecting with Michael Weezy Publishing, I was able to get the work published. And so 25 years later, here we are with that book, having had some kind of an impact, I would say, on the way people tell stories or think about stories in Hollywood especially, but also novelists and lots of other creative people have found a kind of an aha about that book and those ideas, and also Campbell's work. They're very closely interrelated, but that's sort of the short version of my exciting life. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate both your ability to summarize that and frankly your modesty, because it's had a pretty significant impact, to say the least. As far as the scope of this, it's funny because I'm not even sure if I mentioned this detail in our previous chat, but I imagine I'm not alone in that I discovered, I was aware of Campbell, but I read your book prior to reading Campbell. And so it made Campbell much more accessible when I wanted to go back and actually see that source material. But of course, you also have your own insights in your book is you tying things together and applying it to specifically storytelling as we do it in the entertainment business. So have you heard from a lot of people of a similar, kind of moment where they discovered your book and then that made Campbell something that they either discovered or at least they found it more accessible? Because the Hero with a Thousand Faces is great, but it's pretty academic.
Yes, I've heard it, and of course, there's many pathways to get into these things. That's an interesting thing in itself. Is how do you come to knowledge about something? I intentionally tried to be a gateway to Campbell, and maybe wanted to put myself in front of people before they tried to climb that mountain. Here, practice on a little more gradual slope.
Get on the bunny hill before you do the double black diamonds.
Right. That's right. So, I had, that specialized time as a graduate student in film school specifically for that purpose, to study things deeply and try to think hard about them and make it into some kind of working theory. So I did that work, and it was a lot of work, and I have that ambition to save people the labor. I don't want them to skip Campbell. I want them to go there. But I think it's helpful for some people in this busy world to have it somewhat digested and put in terms that people can readily understand Campbell gives many wonderful examples from mythology itself and from psychology. That's basically his frame for this thing. But mine was framed differently around movies. And so I looked at as many movie examples, and I was trying to be really exhaustive about trying to list and describe every operation in a movie that I had ever seen. Mm-hmm. Every possible way of introducing characters, every possible way of finishing, every possible way of developing suspense. And, I really, really beat the bushes to try to be thorough. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of my trademark in the studio system, was that they would give me an assignment, and I would just, go to town and try to give them as thorough a reading on something as I could.
Yeah, I'm not sure when. I mean, reviewing the whole manuscript, but I specifically read all the new material, in detail, getting ready for this. But even just reviewing the mass of the document, I was reminded, of your examples when making your different points really span from early cinema to the present. And there were things like, say, Pulp Fiction that I don't remember reading those examples. And I think, I guess I first had the first edition of the book back when I was in film school. I was in film school in 1990. So the first time I came across your book would have been, I guess, when the first edition came out. So for every edition, is that part of what you did, is you added more contemporary examples?
Yeah, I have a few complete rundowns where I would take 3 or 4 films in each edition, and we're now on the 25th anniversary edition. And each time I would shuffle those a little bit and, take out some film that maybe it was great at its time, but it had faded a little bit in people's remembrance. Mm-hmm. I think in the early edition, I did Last of the Mohicans, and I did something on Death Becomes Her. Okay. And there was a Full Monty. And those are memorable films and terrific films, but they were of their moment, and I'm always looking to refresh with something new. And when we came to the second or third edition, Pulp Fiction had been stirring people up. I remember the kind of wave it made in the studio. Everybody was like, "You got to read the script." Yeah. And even before the movie came out, the sort of shockaroo qualities of it had gotten people's attention. So, and then people, especially younger students, just wanted to talk about that for about 5 years. That was the only film they really wanted me to address, and kind of challengingly, because they assumed, that doesn't fit your pattern, and then I would go, "Really? Yes, it does." Oh yeah.
You just have to put it on a linear. You have to put it on a linear timeline to maybe understand some things, but it sure does. That's part of what I really, when I got to those parts, there were several moments where I stopped and, read in real depth besides just reviewing. And that was one of them. That example.
Right.
I think I've told this story before, so I won't go into the long version, but essentially I went back to my old school at the invitation of my main professor and, gave a talk to the kids about, real life now that I was out a few years. And, when I was hanging out with him in his office, among his stack of VHS screeners was Pulp Fiction, which it was in the theaters maybe 3 weeks, and I'd already seen it, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. And I said, "Oh my gosh, you've got this. You've got to let me borrow it." And he said, "I won't give this to any of the students. They've all asked me, but I'll let you take it." And I took it. And of course I copied it and, gave him his tape back in a few days. And then I quite literally, wore that VHS to where it was just snow. My copy ended up being just so degraded because, every time someone found out I had it, we had viewing parties like constantly where I would run this movie. So, that's kind of my Zapruder film. I must have seen that thing, 70, 80 times. Haven't watched it recently, but it's deeply ingrained.
Well, on the other end of the spectrum, I brought home a bootleg copy from the studio. And my wife and I sat down to watch it in a state of dread, because it had been hyped as so shocking, and it's really going to push your buttons. That we both were terrified, and like we were watching a horror movie or something. And then we're kind of disarmed by the fact that at least half of this is comedy. And then had the fun of analyzing it from my own perspective, this hero's journey perspective, and particularly the moral universe that Tarantino and his co-writer are operating in. That it's a strict moral universe, like something in a John Ford movie. So that one I think stayed in the current edition, and then we added The Shape of Water.
Right, I saw that was a new one for this edition.
That's the new recruit for this edition, and that was a movie that it gets sort of mixed reviews. People loved it, and some people thought it was kind of too obvious and clunky and so forth. But I liked it, and I had a personal connection with it because of the same experience that the director had of seeing the inspiration for it, which was a 50s B movie called The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and that was a haunting thing for me as a little kid. It resonated with me for a long time and sort of filled in a spot in my subconscious. And I think that Del Toro was, having the same kind of reaction to it of siding with the monster and feeling sympathetic for this poor guy swimming around in love with this unreachable human, person, and not able to express it and frustrated, and so early adolescent urges began.
Right, it's pretty relatable. Yeah. So I wanted to I wanted to give him nod and enjoy analyzing that one. Yeah, the actor Doug Jones, who plays the aforementioned creature, he's a friend of multiple friends of mine. I don't know him personally, but so I was kind of following it a bit before it came out, just through all my friends posting who were really keen to see their friends, and he's had a lot of great roles, but he's often been anonymous because of his physicality. He plays, the monster in Pan's Labyrinth or something, but that's a guy. Yeah. It's not a CG creation. And so I think as a movie, that's part of why it was so affecting, is because that is a living, breathing person. It's, playing that part. But of course it starts on the page, as you of all people would remind us. What do you think are some of the, I'm especially hoping to get into a bit of the new material here. And I have it pulled up on my computer, your appendices, with the new material. And I'm wondering, first of all, maybe let's talk in general about how your thinking has evolved beyond simply the hero's journey and to look at all these other dimensions of storytelling. And then maybe let's just take them as they occur to you to talk about in terms of these other modalities that you're using to look at things. It's very, very philosophical and very often Eastern in context, which I thought was pretty fascinating.
Well, it is to me very interesting to follow some of these threads that are woven into the story behind the story, and how storytelling came to be goes back a very, very long way. And so it makes sense to look around for how people in cultures throughout time have processed these things and made storytelling part of their beliefs, but also all these other ways of looking at even the human body have their uses in storytelling, because the human body is your instrument. As a writer, as a storyteller, that's the instrument you are playing. You are playing the organs of the human body. And somehow, through the magic of telepathy or imagination, you are trying, or you should be consciously trying, to reach out into the bodies of the people reading your work or watching your work, and affecting their organs and causing their hearts to beat faster, causing their hands to become sweaty or tense, causing their knees to knock together. I mean, make shivers go down their back, make tears flow, make their throats constrict in fear or grief, make them burst out laughing. All these things, and as I think I said in our last talk, it's not about making them. I correct myself. It's about allowing them, inviting them to have these wonderful experiences that make us love stories. So, I'm looking for how do you do that, and who knows about that, just as I was with Campbell. And that's what led me into examining this business of the chakras.
Right.
I went on a sort of a spiritual with my friend David McKenna, with whom I wrote. We're just a theater director. I was an actor in some shows that he directed, and we thought alike and loved movies. So he helped me work out the hero's journey examples, and the two of us went on this sort of quest, going around, never joining any, but just trying to knock on doors and figure things out. Literally went to a Rosicrucian center and had an interview with some Rosicrucian people, and went down some avenues investigating doorways into consciousness. Different ways of just exploring life and understanding what's going on with these stories. So that's kind of the background for it. I kind of came to all of this in part of my explorations with my pal McKenna, because we met a guru, a guy who read palms. And I mentioned this in the book. I give him credit for opening the door to the chakras and to meditation, because he was this charming palm reader, a guy who reads palms, this ancient craft of looking in your palm and telling you, how long you're going to live and what your fate is going to be. And he's a very charming and entertaining fellow from India. And but he sort of took us on as students to teach us. He felt it was his responsibility. You're interested? You want to know about this? Okay, I'll tell you. So he explained to us how to meditate, what a mantra was, and explained the chakra system to us in a simple, clear way that I try to keep in my chapter on the chakras in the book. So he's the guy who opened the door to my understanding of this. And then I began to realize, as I got into the studio system and I started getting into little higher level meetings where we had to discuss the scripts we've read and defend them and explain why, we should spend millions of dollars on these things. And I found I was pointing as I described my reaction to the script, I would point to different places in my body. And I realized, you know what? I'm pointing to these chakras that my friend Singh Modi was talking about. It kind of rang the bell for me that, there might be something useful to studying this and trying to connect it up with how stories affect us in the organs of the body.
And for the sake, I have it here, but I wonder if I could put you on the spot to sort of do a bit of a summary. I have that chapter in front of me, and my own weird background includes, actually, I was a member of the Rosicrucian Society once upon a time, and I'm interested in a lot of these theories and ideas as well. So that really hit me in our last conversation. And so you were nice enough to send me the work in progress of that chapter. And now I see the current draft in the book. And I like how you've really summarized it. I think that it's very clear, even if someone doesn't have a background in this. But how would you if we could just maybe go from the root chakra and kind of discuss how that is impacted by storytelling?
Yeah, it's hard to actually summarize something as complex and ancient and multi-leveled as the chakras. There are many different versions of it in different areas. People have refined it, and then there's a whole body of Western thought about it, in addition to the different schools in Asia. But I'll give it a shot of just summarizing it. And I think the idea is that within the body, there is an energy system, and we understand some things about it and some stuff we don't understand. Even the best of medical knowledge doesn't really understand how everything is all connected. And the theory is, and this is through the perceptions of great sages of the past and people who have studied the body carefully, that there is an invisible network of force within the body, and that it has centers that are like nerve junctions, and some of them are quite close to the spine and to the actual nerve centers that you can trace in an autopsy. But this is invisible stuff. This is like life itself. It's an invisible part of being a human being. But the idea can be expressed as looking at the body as a kind of a plant that's growing, and it has its roots down in the earth, and there's a series of these centers that go up the spine. And one way of looking at it is that they go up in higher levels of vibration and become more refined and have more spiritually intense jobs to do. The base is called the root chakra, and this is sort of responsible for day-to-day survival and simple things like shelter and enough air to breathe and water and food and security, things like that. So everybody needs to have that safe and secure before you can give much thought to things higher up on the tree. Mm-hmm. And that's something that in stories can be attacked. If your physical safety is threatened, you feel it down there in the lowest part of your body. Your butt cheeks clench together, for one thing.
Yes, they do.
There are physical correspondences to these ideas. The next one up is the creative chakra. That's what I call it. Mm-hmm. Some people call it the sex chakra, but I have expanded my thinking about it to include all kinds of libido, all kinds of creativity. Mm-hmm. And that is something that awakens at a certain natural point in your physical development. You become aware of your sexuality, and for some people that is wide open, like a flower that's blooming luxuriously, and for some people it's maybe a little more tightly closed, like a bud that is just in potential form. And all the chakras are considered that way, as this is sort of the metaphor or the way of illustrating them, is to say that you just imagine that there's a glowing lotus flower that can be closed up tight like a bud, or withered and not fed properly, not watered or attended to properly, or blooming and flourishing. So after the creative, the next thing that might get activated in your personal development is the power chakra. And this is sort of like a nuclear reactor in the lower part of your body, just below the rib cage. And it gets awakened often into your teenage years. You start feeling your power, and you're standing up on your own two legs. And sometimes it's a problem how to manage all that power. But it like all the chakras, it needs to be balanced and harmonized with the others. And if any one of them is kind of running the show out of control, it's not good. It's not healthy. So next thing up is the heart chakra, number 4. And there's quite a jump from the power to the heart level. It's in esoteric terms, they call it the abyss, where you leap from the level of 3 to the level of 4, where things are much more complicated. But the heart, in Western thinking, is the seat of emotions of love. Not all societies go along with that, but we have a strong tradition about that. And getting your heart chakra open and flowing is a very important part of developing compassion for other people, and also self-love and self-compassion appropriately. So all of that is under the rule of the heart chakra. Then you take another level up. This is sort of like each time a quantum leap to a higher level of vibration and higher energy and higher thinking. The next one up is the throat chakra. And this is about expressing yourself, and it's a necessary operation for any artist or vocalist or speaker, politician, whatever, to pry that thing open. And I actually have done some work with people about this who were sort of stuck in their throat, and there are things you can do to kind of bust that open. And that's something I enjoy investigating. How can you open a chakra that's choked off or not operating properly? And this is, you find this all the time in movies. One example recently was The King's Speech, where the whole thing is about the poor king trying to get through a sentence to talk to his people, and gets coached by a good mentor in how to do that. Next up is the third eye chakra, and here you're getting, increasingly spiritual and esoteric, but a lot of cultures believe that there was once a third eye, that as we pass through different stages of evolution, there may have been an actual physical organ there, but the operation remains in somewhere between your eyes or just above them in your forehead, is a theoretical organ of perception, of extrasensory perception. And this is where we sort of store our ideas about ESP and telekinesis and all the other telepathy, all the other extra normal powers. And people speak very much about people who are spiritually adept or who have so-called psychic powers, talk about the experience of opening up the third eye so that they could see into these other worlds. And then the final stop on your advancement, or for the final stage, is opening up the crown chakra, which is actually not even in the body anymore. It's above the top of the head. And the chakra idea, the whole concept, speaks about the body as an energy field that extends well beyond the physical limits of your skin. As you know, you can look at scientific heat reading. You can make a heat picture of a human body and see that there's a corona of heat around the body. And there's also the thing called Kirlian photography, which some people say actually can record the electromagnetic field around a person, or their aura is another way to say that. These things at first glance may sound screwy and esoteric and off the charts and weird, but an awful lot of this is backed up by science. It's an interesting time we live in from that point of view, that they are coming together, and even discoveries in physics are backing up some of these things that are claimed in the esoteric traditions.
Exactly.
So that's my that's my short course on chakra.
I having read many dusty leather volumes on this topic, and not at all being an expert, but having a pretty high degree of familiarity, I would say that's a really great summary. So you started with an example when we were talking about root, and then kind of went through summarizing. But I think that the general ideas I get from the text and also talking with you is that as a writer, as a storyteller, if you want to, you can be thinking of those in your audience when you're applying situations to your characters, right? Like you can attack their safety and security to make people feel that root uneasiness. You can stimulate them with like a sex scene or something else that's really generative to go to that creativity. You can threaten their power, somehow deal with someone's power in a certain way. And you have a lot of examples in this new chapter where you discuss this in a lot of detail. So I don't have to ask you to recite it all here, but what are some of did this discovery, cause you to rethink all of your previous thoughts on the way this works? I mean, you mentioned becoming turned on to this before you wrote The Writer's Journey. So is this something that you've long been gestating on, or is it something that, did you have a working framework of this when you got started, but just not fleshed out or at a point where you wanted to put it into the original text?
Well, it was kind of percolating all along, because occasionally I'd be reading a script and I'd go, aha, I see, he's just been punched in the gut, so to speak, the character. And so his power chakra has been, disabled and scrambled up. So he's going to be limping through the rest of the script until he can get his power back. Or his heart chakra is, you could kind of detect this in the script, whether the writer thought of it or not, but that his heart chakra is bursting to express something, but the throat chakra is shut tight. So he can't get it out. And that's the case I mentioned in the book of the movie Ghost, where even as a ghost, the guy can't form the words "I love you," and that's the final flip of the script, is that he is at last, even as a ghost, able to say that. And so I had been noticing this all along. And I think where it kicked off was, as I mentioned, in the studio meetings when I was working as an executive at Fox. I would sort of steer around all of these demographic things that people were quoting in defending. They would use producer school is the way I put it. Producer school data, sets, and charts of the audience and various ways of algorithms,
Sure.
And I would just point to the organs of my body and say, it got me here and here. It really punched me in the gut and it choked me up, or whatever. I just point to, and I noticed that when it was a good script and I really felt like going to bat for it, it was because it hit two of these things at the same time. So you were activated. Your guts are all astir, worried. You're physically afraid. You're clenched up down there. But at the same time, there's some spiritual thing going on, and you feel you're being lifted up, and the top of your scalp is lifting up because it's some near divine thing you're seeing. So I realized there was circuitry, and that you need to invoke two at least of these centers. You have to threaten or activate two of these things to have a decent story, and maybe three to really have it cooked. Just like with character, you need to make the character three-dimensional, and that means they have to have three dimensions.
Right.
They have to have three different, qualities or problems that are in conflict, and so it really helped me right there. So the thing began to gel then in these meetings, I took it more seriously.
Yeah, I'm working on a rewrite now of something, and I have started applying this to a few of the characters that I wanted to clarify for myself. It's a TV pilot, and I've been finding it as a useful tool. And so going back, you mentioned, people may find it a certain way. Frankly, I'm of the school of thought that you don't have to believe anything, just understand a model and use it. There are people who live every moment of their life by, say, astrology, and then people who think, it's absolutely bunk and have no use for it. But I have a few friends who are deeply knowledgeable, and I find that they don't, quote unquote, believe in it as a prognostication tool for every aspect of their life, but they find it a useful model. And that helps them to use all of their other senses and tools to think their way through a problem or a situation. And so I think this is really applicable, even if you're the least, woo-woo kind of person. And that's what I've been doing, as I've been trying to make sure that these characters are in the appropriate relationships with each other, whether it's supportive or an adversarial situation, and how they're actually impacting each other, how decisions and things impact the other characters, and what that would make them feel like. Right.
Yeah.
And it's been a really useful tool for that. Are you, I want to talk a little bit more about this new edition, but you mentioned getting back into some creative work of your own. And I'm wondering, how long have you been applying this to your own work in earnest? Is this something that you've been using for a while, or are you using it more now than ever?
Well, not consciously until now, I think. One of the steps along the way that advanced me yet again was after the studio time, after my executive time, I was kind of freelance for a while, rattling around, and I ended up working on an independent film with the actor Steve Guttenberg, who had commissioned or optioned a novel called P.S. Your Cat is Dead, and which is also a stage play. He made an independent film about that, and I went into the editing room and worked with him for about 4.5 months, and discovered that this chakra thing was operative in the editing. And that basically, and this was a huge breakthrough, what we were doing with the editing and all the other tricks and music and everything else you try to throw at the audience is we were manipulating their chakras through the breathing of the audience. And that's really what the editing was doing. It was controlling and regulating the breathing of the audience so that we would maybe lull them into breathing kind of in a relaxed manner and normal in, out, and then, not allow them to breathe for 2 or 3 minutes in a row because there was a big row or fight scene going on where there was suspense, and then relax again and let them take a deep sigh. Or a gasp of surprise. And, we realize it's like we're playing some kind of Wurlitzer organ that has all these stops on it.
Right.
That you can pull this stop out, and that will make people choke up. This stop over here makes them giggle. That one over there makes them squint their eyes and hate the character because of what he just did. So that's now coming back as I go to work on one of my personal projects that's been kicking around in my trunk for many years. So I'm tackling this thing in a different format that's new to me. Instead of trying to express a very complex canvas with lots of characters and a long time period, in screenplay form, I'm trying to address it as a novel, and I'm finding, again, that I have to grow a new brain to do that. And that's wonderful. I love it because I think that's how you stay young in your mind and involved, is to give yourself challenges like that. But I'm finding that you have so many choices in that format about how to get into the story, into the characters, how far off you are. Are you hovering above like an eagle, or are you down there inside their gut telling me what's happening inside the guts? I've read some Civil War novels that are done that way, where, on the first page, you're inside General Grant, and he's just mad as hell, and there's like a volcano going off inside him. And right. I love that, and I want to strive to dare to get that deep into my characters. And I think that does involve thinking about where they're open and where they're closed. Where do they need to grow? Will it crack open, explode open? Will it generally unfold like a flower? Or, how are they going to open up that part that's closed? And where are they strong and thriving that they can build on? And then how do all those things kind of work together to enhance each other? So
that sounds like a good strategy. So you're also using this chakra model to really help you as you map out your characters and your story.
Yes, for the first time, I think consciously, because it's always been there, but now having written about it, I think made a difference. I respect Stephen King's writings on writing. And one of the things he says is, you don't know what you know until you write about it.
Yeah.
So I had to sort of tear myself inside out to say, well, what does this really mean to you, and how does it really work? And then that makes it accessible to me. And that's what I hope for the book, is that it will open up this door a little bit for people and save them the labor and pain I went through to bring this thing to light.
And hopefully motivate the pain of writing.
Yeah, and it's just another one of the templates. And I think you made a good point about you don't have to buy into it. You don't have to be a lifetime subscriber. You don't have to believe every part of it. Just cherry pick the stuff that makes sense to you. It's another metaphor. And something, maybe you want to use it only on one project where, it makes sense. This is a maybe spiritual character, or maybe it's something that you actually want them to, you want to illustrate that. You want to dramatize that. Somebody actually opening up one of their chakras or making some breakthrough like that. But it's one of many metaphors or tools in the toolbox. And another one I use, and I could do a chapter on that as well, would be the tarot. I've used the tarot, especially for character work.
Okay.
If you just throw a set of cards the way you're directed to do for that character, it will tell you volumes about that character.
Yeah.
If you open yourself up to it, if you're not, completely skeptical, which would kill it. But if you're open to it, the cards will tell you stuff. And I have had some very interesting experiences with that. So one of many things in the toolbox.
Well, it reminds me the late great Mark McCormick, business exec of a lot of note, but of course he wrote the classic "What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School," and I read that in the first paperback edition. And although he's deceased, they still keep doing new editions apparently. But there was something he said in there, among many things, that really stuck with me, and one of them was, I'm paraphrasing for the sake of this conversation, but he said something along the lines of, you don't have to know how every single tool was built to use that tool. So if a tool exists and you understand how to use it as applies to your situation, do it. Go for it. You don't have to know the history of how that came to be. You don't have to know every other application. Just use it to the way that it has utility for you. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's in sync with what you're suggesting here.
Yeah, it's true of tools that sometimes not being trained in how this is meant to be used can be useful, because you may find there's a thing here, I don't know what to call it. Some people say this is a wrench, but for me right now, it's a perfect doorstop or whatever. Right. That I don't need it to be a wrench now. I need it to be something else.
Exactly.
And that kind of flexibility in your thinking is great. And I'm just delighted to find little fragments of things that I put into my bag along with all the other thoughts. Like just today, I read something about Gene Hackman, and somewhere he said, I just look at the character I'm going to play, and I think, how is he like me, and how is he not like me? And I thought, oh, that's great. Yeah. I'm going to think about that for my characters, because I'm tackling a big subject, and I'm trying to get into an enormous historical character that is scary, because, it's hard to approach a giant character that people have all kinds of impressions about. But I want to try. I want to try and get in there, and that's one of the tools I'm going to use. Is I know he's like me in some ways, and in other ways he's very different, and I'm going to explore that. So always looking for more goodies like that to put to work.
Well, let me ask you this as we sort of, because I want to save some time to get into what you're working on in a little more detail. In terms of going back through preparing this big 25th anniversary edition, and of course you have all the new material you've added, what are some of the insights or revelations you had just going through this multi-decade project of yours? What are some things that struck you and that maybe hit you in a fresh way that in the existing text, and then of course we have all the new material? But yeah, what were some of the I'm curious about your writer's journey, rewriting the writer's journey is kind of the question.
Yeah, it was not a clear case for me. I wasn't sure that it needed to be revived, but I now feel quite differently, having gone through the process, that it was time to question a lot of things, a lot of ways I had of expressing myself, and the gender issues. I haven't solved that problem by any means.
I don't know if we ever will, but.
I don't know. That's a forever vanishing target. You try to be as conscious as you can, but it's tough. But there's something about 25th anniversaries, which are celebrated in the movie business. Friends of mine who worked on films that are now 25 years old get another spin. The thing is reevaluated and renoticed because you've survived that long and you're still in public consciousness, and people are ready to go back and take a look at some things. I hear from my publisher, Michael Weezy, that the writer's journey jumped immediately as soon as they announced it. It's not coming out until August of 2020. Okay. But as soon as they announced it, it went to number one on Amazon in pre-sales.
Wow, that's great.
So it tells us, it's Congrats. Great. It tells us that people are, okay, there's a new spin on this, we're ready for that. And then there was a whole process I went through leading up to this at the same time that Michael Weezy asked me about doing this edition, I also was tasked to write a paper that was coinciding this was for a German journal of academic excellence, and they had decided to do a special issue on Joseph Campbell 25 years after Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie came out. So, and that's when I started gestating the ideas of the writer's journey. So all these things sort of coincided and made me take a look back. And I was tasked in this academic paper to evaluate Campbell's influence and somewhat my influence, and found that to be, there was some impact.
Sure.
There's no question that it framed a lot of the discourse and affected things about how people think about storytelling. So this has been a positive. In the long run, it turned out to be a positive evaluation. And I look on myself with mercy. Like you didn't do so bad. That was. And I'm also awestruck as I look through the book at how thorough I was, and how I did really, really try. That younger self of mine really tried to think of everything he could.
Well, you mentioned that we were talking before the actual call and catching up a bit on various things we have going on and what's in the works. And so the takeaway for you that I got was that you have been reevaluating your own professional efforts. You mentioned working on the novel, for instance. What are some other things that you have, and how has this sort of, how has your direction shifted recently?
Well, as I've sort of withdrawn from the Hollywood direct combat, daily combat, I was in the trenches for plenty of time, so I don't miss that aspect of it. But I just have a little more time for my own personal development. And one thing I haven't mentioned, and I don't think hardly anybody who knows me from the writer's journey is aware of this, but I have an enormous sub-life devoted to toy soldiers, especially plastic toy soldiers, like stuff that I had when I was a kid. And that has become a tremendous outlet for me. And it somehow merges together with the kind of writing I want to do now. And it where they intersect is in building worlds. That's what I'm doing with the toys. I'm building environments or settings, and I find I'm doing the same thing in tackling a historical novel of some complexity. I'm assembling the parts and the characters and the props and the equipment and backgrounds and everything, and then arranging them in a way that's pleasing to me, and I think I hope will communicate some of the joy I find in this world that I've been living in for 25 years. I want somebody else to be able to walk around in there. And so I'm building three-dimensional models of the scenes with these toy soldiers, as well as turning that into pages and paragraphs and chapters. So that's this is a little extra thing that I reveal here.
Very nice. Well, I don't know if you would reveal what you're working on, or maybe I'll ask you off mic if you're not ready to spill the beans on that yet.
Well, I can speak in general terms that I somehow got fascinated by the 16th century, and that includes everything from the conquest of Mexico to the Spanish Armada to the last tail end fights of the Crusades in the Mediterranean, the Siege of Malta. There's that was quite a busy century,
yes.
And
yes, it
was
was
very dynamic, and there's very dynamic characters in it, and it's a tapestry to me, and I have followed a trail about it that led me through my Disney days. It came from childhood. My interest in this was triggered by certain Warner Brothers films. The Seahawk is one in particular with Errol Flynn. And then I went back and revisited some of these times and characters when I worked for Disney, because they were constantly turning over history and researching. And that was, part of my identity there professionally was, you want to know about the Aztecs? Ask that guy Vogler over in the story department.
Okay.
And a couple of weeks from now, he'll give you a complete, entertaining, illustrated report on the Aztecs with all kind of story suggestions and so forth. So some of my idols from that time, Queen Elizabeth, for example, and Philip II of Spain and Sir Francis Drake and characters like that, kind of came and went in my admiration. I would research them a little bit and go, oh, they're not so wonderful. No, they're not the great characters I saw in the movie. But then as I dug deeper over the following decades, I got more friendly with them and understood better. So it's been partly this excavation. And as a writer who's writing about people who actually lived, many people I've talked to, many novelists agree with this, that they are open to communicating with you if you want to write about them, and they want their story told, and they all feel they never got it right, and I'm giving it to you to tell it the right way. So that's how I feel about it. That I'm in good communication with my characters, and I'm getting their blessing for telling the story the way I'm going to tell it.
Nice.
So that's some of the background to this.
Okay. Well, this is I'm definitely curious, and I may pepper you a little bit once we end the proper for public consumption part of this. But I was fortunate as part of an extended documentary project with my old partner years ago that we went to Malta. And so I spent a little bit of time there, not nearly enough for my satisfaction, but we visited some of the landmarks related to like the shipwreck cathedral there, and the headquarters of the Knights of Malta, things like that. So I find all of that, given all my other interests, I find that particularly interesting. So yes, I'm going to be more nosy when we're off of the actual interview part of this.
That's fine. I have been to Malta myself. I forced my relatives to go on a cruise there almost at gunpoint, and they rebelled the whole time, and they hated the food, but they said it was hot and everything else, but I didn't care because I had to see those sites and get as close to it as I could.
Like the megalithic the megalithic temples and things like that.
Yeah, some of the oldest structures we know, and all of that, and then the esoteric side of it, because the Knights, were aware of those things, and they spoke that language. Yes.
Yeah, totally. So, well, we might lose a few people for a moment, but we'll get back to the more mundane as we sort of begin to wrap it up. I'll have to let you go in a moment, as often happens. Like a hour and a half just kind of flies by when I chat with you, which is really fun. So in terms of what you're working on this novel, and you've pulled back from kind of your consulting work. What else are you doing in terms of ahead of the release? You mentioned it's August is the street date for your book, and of course we're recording this right now, sort of toward the later part of January. So, do you have a lot of responsibilities left with the book, or is that kind of in MWP's hands at this point?
Well, I'm trying to line up as many interactions with writers as I can by going to different writers' conventions and so forth around the country. I'm going out to Palm Springs to visit with the Desert Screenwriters. I'm going to an event in Tallahassee in July that has to do with film educators. I'm doing an event with the Portland Christian Writers. That's another interesting audience. And the Oklahoma City Writers Convention. So I'm doing a lot of stuff in the country, which is a change of pace for me because most of my teaching work has been overseas. Mm-hmm. But it's good for the book that I get out and talk about it in advance with as many stateside writers as I can.
Sure.
So
sure.
I'm looking forward to that and seeing what's on their minds, which I always do everywhere I go. I'm acutely interested in. Okay, I have my thing, but what are you guys thinking about? And
yeah.
What are the local problems for you? Mm-hmm. So I try to stay open.
Fantastic. Well, Chris, where should I point people to? Where should we have people go online to check you out?
Well, I think the best way to get to know me at this stage is I have a WordPress blog, and that is Chris Vogler at WordPress.com.
Okay.
Let's double check that. Yeah.
And I can pop.
It's Chris Vogler. Yeah, it's chrisvogler.wordpress.com.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to put that link in the show notes, and of course, people can pre-order that book on Amazon. I'll also put a link in the show notes for that. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you again. I hope we get to do it again.
Absolutely. Mind expanding as always. Thank you for your provocative, interesting questions, Brendan.
Thank you.
And thanks a lot.
All right, that's the show for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I have something special planned for next week as well. I'm not going to state it just yet because things tend to change so fast. I don't want to jinx myself, but I will simply say that I am traveling back through Atlanta at the beginning of this next week and spending a couple of days before I return to Palo Alto. And I'm hoping to catch back up with a friend of the show for another round 2. And I'll leave it at that. Let's see how that all comes together, but we're planning on it, so we have to make sure that there's no scheduling curveballs. But I appreciate you listening to the show. You could support the show by sharing it with people you think would enjoy, subscribing in whatever podcatcher you listen to. Please be sure to like the episode if you see this on a social platform or something. And otherwise, I just appreciate you listening. Thanks a lot. Again, I'm Brendan Davis, and I'll see you next week on If I Knew You Better.